It's time to accelerate. Hey friends, this is Andy. Welcome to episode 554 of Accelerate, the sales podcast of record where I hold in-depth conversations with today's leading experts in sales, marketing, and leadership 6 days a week. It's Monday. It's the start of a brand new week, and among the many hot topics we're going to be talking about this week on the show with my guests are, one, the future of sales training. We're going to talk about that today and what we can do to fix the broken sales model. We're going to talk about how to become a power connector, meaning how to build a really effective network of connections. We're going to talk about how to achieve excellence in all that you do with the author of a best-selling book called The Difference, When Good Enough Isn't Enough. And we're going to talk about how to perfect your sales forecasting. So coming up on the show today is my guest, Burt. Connor is the COO at Lessonly. Lessonly is a next-generation team learning platform. And we're going to talk about why sales training is broken and what we can all do, how we can all contribute to fixing it going forward into the future. Now, if you'd like to see the show notes for this episode, go to andypaul.com/554. You'll find timestamp breakdown of this conversation and all conversations on Accelerate there. Check it out. And as always, if you like the show, it would really help us out if you subscribed, left a review for us. You can do that all with the podcast app on the phone you're using to listen to this podcast. So go ahead, do that now, and then come back and listen to the rest of the show. So let's jump into it. Burt, welcome to Accelerate.
Hey, thanks, Andy. Great to be here.
My pleasure. Gosh, thanks for being here with me. So we start the show with a pretty standard question I ask all my guests, and that is, in your mind, what's the single biggest challenge facing sales reps today?
Ooh, that's a great question, Andy. I would, in our world of SaaS,
SaaS.
Yeah.
No, I love the way that we need a new term, but yeah, go ahead.
I'm thinking of the capital S and then the last capital.
Two little A's, yes, yeah.
Yeah. But I think the challenge in software specifically is buyers are just inundated with, first of all, requests to review software and kind of prospecting. Mm-hmm. And also, what you see is organizations, regardless of the category of software you're selling, the sprawl of teams buying their own software, and you look at an organization and there's 350 different software tools across the organization. And it doesn't even sometimes matter what category of software you're selling. Oftentimes you're competing for priority against those 300 other tools that the organization's already invested in. And this huge challenge for the organization is to kind of whittle it down to what are the kind of key priorities for the organization this year. And so I think for sellers, 10 years ago, it might have been, hey, I'm investing in this category of software. I need to differentiate in my category. I think now you're almost seeing sellers need to fight for priority of your category first before you can even get there. So I think it's just gotten a lot more complex to get the mind share of an organization to think about kind of the problem you're solving, elevated above all the other kind of problems they're trying to solve as it relates to software sales.
Okay. All right. I have to think about that one. I think that one of the just facts of life is given sort of the new pricing models, and given that SaaS products still offer freemium options and so on, is it's pretty easy to bring in a lot of different tools, right? And
Absolutely.
I think that it just muddies the water for sellers. So interesting. Well, good. All right, great answer. All right, so let's talk about Lessonly. Let's talk about sales training. So another sort of broad question is, in your mind, why is sales training so broken?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing I would say there, Andy, is you think about an organization of any size. Let's say they're north of 100 employees and they've got at least 20 or 25 reps. I think one of the things and this trend that we're seeing is, number one, is sales training is broken because everybody wants to enable sales. So they're kind of the driving engine of the organization. So you think about it, it's like, HR wants to enable them on something. Marketing wants to enable them on the latest piece of content and the greatest new ebook they pushed out. Product has this great feature that's just going to change the game. And I think one of the challenges for a sales organization is really just to synthesize all of that into what is actually going to help a sales rep be more productive, is kind of one of the first and most prominent things that we see, is just so many things thrown at the sales org, with no thought to how do we synthesize and orchestrate all of these concepts, these materials, ideas into something that the seller can actually go use in their day-to-day as they're thinking about closing the next deal. That'd be the first thing I'd say.
Yeah, well, I think you can certainly see that, right? Because, I mean, if you look at it as sales is a channel, and everybody wants access to the channel, right? There's a channel to the customer. Everybody wants access to that. They want to influence it somehow.
Of course.
And I think back to days when I worked at Apple back in sort of the early days of Apple, where, we sold through, retail. And, everybody wanted access to the retail channel. All the product managers had their own little project they wanted to get out there. And, one market they wanted to address and so on. And there are people inside of Apple whose job was to try to meter that flow so that they didn't overwhelm the channel.
Yeah. And, I think the other thing I would say is just kind of somewhat related to that experience. I think, organizations kind of tell themselves we're doing all right with training. And they tell themselves, we've got a pretty good onboarding program. And sometimes we do these kind of learning rallies across the country. And I put up this slide and I say, for all the sales leaders in the room, if I were to go ask one of your sales reps, and it just said, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Sales Rep, on a scale of A to F, how has the training you've received here helped you perform to the best of your ability? I kind of let that sit. And most of the sales leaders in the room, you can kind of feel this like pit in their stomach forming, and they're thinking to themselves, like, when I've asked that directly to them, most of them say, that we'd probably give ourselves, a B or a C, or the reps would give us a B or a C. And so I think the problem with sales training today is, number one, we don't recognize that it's even a problem, and it gets put on the back burner to all the other kind of sales management functions, whether that's just deal management, forecasting, hiring, and it gets pushed down and down the priority list. And there isn't enough of a recognition that for the individual seller, we're actually failing them from a training perspective, would be the kind of second thing I'd mention there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, sort of the data somewhat supports that, right? I mean, we hear about, and whether, again, there's all sorts of data, different data that's out there about, sales rep productivity is stagnant at relatively low levels, and the investment in sales. I mean, a professor from Harvard Business School was saying that the annual expenditure in the U.S. on sales is like $92 billion. Not in sales training, but in sales, right? So we have this huge investment at stake in sales.
Wow.
And what we do is we bring them together once or twice a year and put them in a classroom and teach them something that they've forgotten by the time they walk out the door.
Exactly. And I think that's a good point too. I remember reading Mark Robert's from HubSpot's book.
Sales Acceleration Formula, great book.
Yeah, I loved it. One of the pieces I really remember was, essentially HubSpot in kind of early days was at this juncture where, we have, let's say 50 reps. We've got aggressive growth targets. How are we going to get there? And I think what I admired about Robert's philosophy was, I'm going to hit my growth targets by making each of my reps better versus hiring another 10 or another 20, right? I want to optimize kind of my current team's productivity before I go scale and start adding reps. And I think today in the world we live in, especially in the venture funded high growth technology companies, at times the adding quota bearing capacity can seem like a quicker path to growth than developing the team that you have and making each individual better. And I think that's a mistake, just from an organizational level, because, you're just burning through resources. Like you said, 92 billion. A lot of that is probably just hiring for capacity versus optimizing what you have.
Well, and I think part of the disincentive you see on the part of some of those companies to really invest in sales training is that they feel like they're training the rep for the next company they go to.
Yeah.
Because if you have an average tenure of 12 to 18 months for a sales development rep, then you're saying, gosh, I really invest heavily in training them.
Yeah.
They're just going to take that and go. And there hasn't been, I think, enough work to really sort of understand as well, geez, maybe if we really trained them and did a better job in some other areas, that they may actually stay.
Yeah.
Or be worthy of staying. We might promote them into, an AE job or CSM job or something that was a next step up in their career.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. That also reminds me, there's a gentleman that I've only had a couple of conversations with him, but he ran sales at a software company called Acquia. And, we were just kind of sharing ideas and strategies. He had taken their team from something like 25 reps to something like 200 in a couple of years. And one of the things that stuck out with me is he had shared that they kind of thought about hiring in two ways. One was, we can develop our bench of sellers from an SDR model, or we can hire experienced or semi-experienced even people off the street. And this was a fairly inside sales model, nothing super enterprise. And he shared me, over the course of that kind of scale period, his reps that he promoted at the end of their first year were 60% more productive than the reps that they hired off the street and tried to bring into the business and, quote unquote, had experience and knew how to sell, which I thought it just kind of rung true with me of, developing talent in-house and bringing people up. If you do it right, I think seems like it can have, real benefits.
Well, yeah, and I think that gets back to training, because if it really depends on your perspective when you hire. If you are hiring with the intent that these people are going to be your bench, right? They're the ones that are going to move up.
Yeah.
Then you have a different perspective on the capabilities and the qualities and the characteristics, the traits, the basic habits that you're hiring.
Yeah.
And it's a really astute point you made, because I think that many companies in the SaaS space don't do that. They're hiring to scale, as you said, and just hoping they can get 12 to 18 good months out of someone before they burn out and go.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, hey, we're hiring this year, we're going to hire 50 SDRs. I want each one of them to be promotable.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you got to think, I don't have any stats for you, but you got to think, to your point, that 12 or 18 month tenure and people turning over, to some degree, I'm sure you can't eliminate it, goes down when the individual at the other end of your SDR team actually feels, like they have a path, they're being invested in, they're getting better, they're being challenged. And you got to think that makes a difference on things like turnover in those types of roles. Yeah.
I mean, all the other things being in place, good management, good coaching, a corporate culture that's supporting this whole thing. Yeah. I mean, you can have really good people, and if they're in an environment that's just, hey, we're just here to do the numbers and, how much more can I beat out of you? Then nothing's going to keep them from jumping to the next bright, shiny object.
Yes.
So, all right. So let's talk about what Lessonly does a little bit. So, maybe tell us a little bit about the company, how you got started, and what the mission was when you started.
Yeah, you bet. So our mission has become, from day one. Well, let me start, I guess, where we got started. I was essentially working at a small startup that was acquired by a company in Indianapolis that we all look up to here. We're based out of Indiana, called ExactTarget. So I was
now part of Salesforce.
Now part of Salesforce, yes. And these kind of series of acquisitions were happening. And I was in this small little startup with a 5-person sales team. And we were selling a fairly complex product. It was predictive analytics for online retailers. Mm-hmm. And I quickly learned that as soon as the acquisition happened, we had now this army of 1,000 ExactTarget sales reps across the world. And I figured out as a rep that the better I could teach them what this product did and how to position it with their existing customer base, the better I did, because it was kind of like an overlay scenario. Mm-hmm. And so ExactTarget essentially came to the 5 sales reps on our team and turned us into essentially trainers, because there was no other way to quickly mobilize a huge sales force on a new product. And the first thing they asked me to do, which I thought was totally messed up, was to go to Australia for 6 months. And there was only a team of about 25 people in Australia. And they wanted me to go for 6 months just to train 25 people on what I thought was a fairly easy to understand concept. And I said, this seems crazy. This seems overly expensive. And I had a roommate at the time who was kind of in the early stages of, he's now our CEO, Max, developing, V1 of Lessonly. Right. And I said, hey, let me try this thing. So essentially the foundation of that turned into, I'm going to dump knowledge from my head and everything I know about this product into 10 lessons that I'm going to assign to those 25 people in Australia. And I'm going to see what happens. So I did that. I went to Australia, and not surprisingly, the people who had self-educated, kind of went through my content, took the time to do it, which I could see, were taking me into deals with Hotels.com and TripAdvisor, like the day I walked in the door. Of course, you'd expect that to happen, right? But the other 20 who didn't take the content, I sat there for 3 months around a conference room table while everyone's checking their email and on their phone and working deals, and I got nowhere. And so I thought to myself, if a company at the scale of Target, 2,000 employees, can't mobilize training and even just basic information to a sales force quickly, there's got to be this problem elsewhere. And so that was kind of my journey into Lessonly. Since then, we've gone on. We've got about 350, 400 clients across the world, and we really focus on helping teams drive better performance through learning. And so typically that is a sales team or another customer-facing team. And the core concept is to allow the organization to get kind of this peer-driven culture of learning, create the lessons on the topics that matter most to the individual seller, and then set up really great programs for ongoing development and self-education inside the customer-facing teams.
And so you have like an authoring tool then, right? That so it makes it pretty simple then for people, as you said, you just sort of sat down and transferred your knowledge into it.
Absolutely, yeah. There's the authoring component, and then for the individual sales rep, what we do is we essentially make it extremely accessible. So there's a few ways. One is you can access all of this learning content through Salesforce or at your standalone destination. You can see things like your learning path. So if you imagine bringing on a new sales rep, you'd have like a 90-day learning path that you'd be going down, and you can see where you're at. And then finally, we usually give the organization access via a simple Chrome extension. So if I'm browsing anywhere on the internet, I'm a knowledge worker, I'm working in Salesforce doing my thing, I can revisit that training material that I've already been through. So we try to bring the idea of these fundamental lessons into your kind of day-to-day working world, which often relies on your computer and the web and everywhere you're spending your time.
And so with your customers, I mean, is the emphasis, I'm sort of curious about the training that they develop, because there is this acknowledged problem that getting sales professionals to invest their own time in learning is really difficult. Yeah. So do your customers, are they setting aside time during the day where they want people to engage in the learning, or is it situational? Hey, I'm getting ready to go on a call, I'm going to pull something up and look at it. I mean, how's it sort of basically used?
Yeah, I would say most customers use it. They don't necessarily set aside time. I think the interesting thing is when the organization does a good job. So one of our great customers is a software company out of DC called Fiscal Note. We've learned a lot from them. And give you an example, essentially what they've done is they've invested a lot upfront in the content, and that content comes from both management and sales enablement, but also individual reps. So win reviews of deals, like individual in the pit, this is how I won this deal, could be a lesson. And what they're doing and what they're finding is when we organize this content well, when we make it relevant, our reps are probably going to engage because they see that it benefits them. So really the tool itself drives what we would call assignments. So a rep is notified at the right time when, hey, there's a new assignment to go take on a competitor or a new assignment to go take on product. And ultimately, we organize all of the company's sales training content into usually 5 buckets, which are, here's what you need to know about the company, the mission, the vision, the values. Here's what you need to know about the industry. Here's what the value of our product and product knowledge is. Here's the process you need to follow. And then here are some more of the soft skills type training related to things like negotiation or later stage deal development or territory development, things like that. So usually the rep kind of goes through an onboarding path and then has kind of a weekly or ongoing topic that's top of mind for the business that they'll get assigned.
So a manager will assign it?
Yeah, usually a manager.
Okay. And so do they, excuse me, I'm losing my voice here for a second. So do they, have quizzes built in? They have to have certain scores, before they progress to another module, or is it more ad hoc than that?
No, there's depends on the type of content, but the primary model we see most people following is this idea of, take this lesson, so kind of learn this, then go practice it. So we've got some functionality in the tool that allows an organization to say, hey, you just learned about our biggest competitor. Record yourself handling this scenario. So kind of like pitch recording for like elevator pitches or scenario pitches so that the organization can quickly see that you've understood it. Part of that sometimes is an actual assessment in terms of multiple choice. That's usually more relevant for like product type stuff. And then ultimately we measure those things to see if it's impacting performance. So things like a Salesforce integration for our customers are relevant to see, hey, I ran this big training campaign against these two competitors. Let's actually see if our win rates went up against those competitors. So we really try to drive into, is training impacting performance, which is a really hard thing to kind of measure, but you can certainly start to correlate some things and try to understand if your training is actually working.
Yeah, well, I think the important qualifier there with correlations. But I that is one of the key points that CEOs surveyed about sales training bring up most frequently is I can't calculate an ROI on it. Yeah,
it's tough. And I think the place most of our customers start, Andy, is to demonstrate that it's working is ramp times, because it's so important to a scaling business. So before I implemented training program X, my ramp time was 120 days, and now I've cut that in half, right? Because it's more organized, it's better content, different delivery methods. I bring in really smart sales consultants, maybe like yourself. It just depends on what you choose to do. But I think that's a clear, hey, we did this and decreased ramp time. Obviously, there's some rep variability in there, but if you hire enough, that usually is the first data point people tend to look at.
And so, again, interesting question then is so how are people measuring that the ramp is complete? Just based on completion of the quizzes and tests, or that, hey, they've gone out and executed?
Yeah, no, we typically like to look, or at least ask our clients to look at, when do they get to, I usually like to use about 80% of a fully productive quota. Seems to be a really, kind of qualitative measure. So how long does it take you from hire date to I'm doing 80% of my number consistently, and what's that time period? So it's not really even related to the training material that you're necessarily completing through that process. It's more so, does that training material that you're going through influence that kind of time it takes you to get to full production?
And that 80%, is that 80% of an activity metric or some sort of revenue target?
For quota bearing reps, we do the revenue targets. Or sometimes that can get skewed with like a couple of big deals. So sometimes it makes more sense to say this number of clients is when we consider a fully ramped rep, number of opportunities you've actually closed. For more of an SDR role, we typically look more at activity metrics. So if you're driving your SDRs to set a certain amount of demos, when are they getting to that number of demos? But I think it's organizational to decide on what the ramp metric is. Those are the two we suggest, depending on the role. But I think the important thing is you measure it consistently and measure it over time to see if you're getting better or worse.
Yeah, well, and this raises sort of the larger question, which you and I touched on it before we went on the air here, was what's it really take to move the needle on productivity and sales and make it sustainable? Again, sort of the sort of almost mythical reports. People talk about CSO insights and so on these days. 50% of reps aren't making quota. Assuming that's in the ballpark, right?
Yeah.
and hasn't really changed much over years. And so we could say, well, hey, that's the way it meant to be. Or if that's just how it is and not how it could be, what's the key from a training perspective? And granted, it's just one part of the equation, but from a training perspective, to move the needle on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, because you're right. It is one lever to get things moving. So I think the kind of what I mentioned earlier around getting it to the right priority level in the organization has to be number one, because if you don't prioritize it at an organizational level and you don't have the right philosophy on development at large, and you don't value the individual growth of your sellers, it's going to be really hard to design programs that, actually move the needle. So I'd say the priority is first. I think from there, typically what I would suggest as a starting point to customers is, we like to think of this problem of training needs to be solved by one or two people in the organization. And oftentimes the knowledge of being a good seller lives inside your sales org somewhere. So it's probably some of your better reps. It's probably some of your better managers, or even some of your SDRs who have learned things along the way about your product, your industry, your positioning. And I think the starting point is to make sure you're collecting those insights, obviously synthesizing them, and putting it into a more formal program. I think the mistake a lot of people make is they design this, onboarding ramp program in a vacuum, and they don't gather either inputs or actual, participation from your better reps or your better managers, who are actually really the ones in the day-to-day thick of closing deals. They understand what prospects are saying, and they've lost enough to know what do we need to change going forward. So that's kind of a broad answer, but that's kind of one tactical thing. Sure. I think we make the mistake of as sales leaders.
Well, I made a bet with somebody that was in the sales training industry. And I said, look, yeah, they had access to tools, and not yours per se, but let's say similar tools and so on. And I said, if you gave me a sales team and we had opportunity to do sales training sort of conventionally, I said, versus I could give you a curriculum of 9 or 10 books that if we had your people read the books over the course of a year, that I'd be willing to bet that we'd have as much, or if not more uplift from the group that read the books than the training. Yeah. Because so much of the training is just situational, and it doesn't really address the bigger person, right? The whole person, the things that they need to understand. You and I talked about in an earlier conversation about, how to improve our human-based selling skills. Yeah. Right? How do we get better at connecting? How do we be better at engaging? How do we do better at opening a conversation? All these things that are really crucial that a lot of times you learn from books. Yeah. And I find it interesting that, you could invest thousands in a training system, or you could invest hundreds in a book. And I've run trial programs with a couple of customers where we've done this, where, for a pretty small amount of dollars, sure, they had but what they did, to a point I made earlier, is they gave their team time during the business day to read 20 minutes every day. And so over the course of a year, they worked through all these books. They had reading guides, discussion guides. Every week they discussed it in their sales meeting. And like I said, there was this uplift.
Yeah, no, that's a really, I love that bet. I think maybe the pylon bet I would make, and again, probably outside of technology, is I would love to say, could you take those 9 books, synthesize in a little bit more concise way? How does this philosophy or this psychology book that I just read, or this sales book that I just read, how does this relate to my day-to-day role as a seller? And if you had your, best rep who read that book, translate it to the world that the everyday sales rep lives in, and then you gave them that, document, module, lesson, whatever you want to call it. If you gave them that thing to read,
Cliff Notes.
Yeah, Cliff Notes, and maybe a few practice scenarios that they could go through at the end of it, just to kind of flex the muscle of what they should be taking away. I bet you could get the same results potentially faster.
It's a very interesting idea. We'll talk about that offline.
I never thought about it though. It's a really good point. It really is.
All right. Well, Connor, we've run out of time, but it's been fantastic talking to you. We'll have to do this again sometime. So tell folks how they can learn more about Lessonly and connect with you.
Yeah, you bet. I'm terrible at most social media channels. So me personally, find me on LinkedIn. It's about the only place I'm active. For us at Lessonly, we're at lessonly.com.
All right. Well, hey, brave admission about your social media skills. So I admire you for that, so admitting that in public. So, all right, Connor, thanks a lot. Friends, thank you for spending this time with us today. Make sure you come back, join us again tomorrow for another fantastic episode of Accelerate. Until then, I'd really appreciate if you have time, go to iTunes, subscribe, leave a review for Accelerate. We want to hear what you have to think about what we're doing, how we can make it better for you. So thanks again for joining me. Until next time, this is Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.